Lesson 57. Why does Spanish have personal endings? Okay, Antonio, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about just the origins of Spanish. In our last lesson, we discussed the personal endings that Spanish verbs have. And so in this lesson, we're talking a little bit about where the Spanish language comes from and the fact that really it's drawn directly from Latin. It comes directly from Latin. And so that's why the verbs have these verb endings, these personal endings, is because that's a direct remnant of Latin. The Latin verb system has personal endings like this. And as we say here in the text, the Romans conquered and occupied what would today be Spain. And over time, the Latin that was spoken in Spain, it gradually turned into Spanish. And so the verb system and the personal endings from Latin, that's what's given birth to the verb system and the personal endings of the Spanish verb system. So Antonio, I'd like to ask you a question. With all this in mind, growing up, did you realize that the Spanish language really comes from Latin like that? In other words, do they teach that in the schools and such?
Definitely not in the first early elementary school, but in the later grades, you start realizing and they start telling you about it. Yes, we know about the connection there from an early age, I would say.
Do a lot of Spanish speakers study Latin, like in colleges and high schools and such?
Oh, yes. In fact, my mother studied Latin, especially in college, and she's very good at it, actually.
Well, in this lesson, not only for educational purposes, but also just for fun, we thought that we would try to raise the awareness on the part of the reader, the awareness that Spanish does come from Latin. So we decided to put a fun little exercise here, where on the left side of the page we have Latin words, and then on the right side of the page we have a group of Spanish words, and it's a matching game. You have to draw a line from the original Latin word on the left to the Spanish word that comes from that Latin word. In other words, the derivative that comes from the original Latin word. So why don't we go over these a little bit and help our listeners sort through these. Okay, well, the first one is rex, which in Latin means king. The possessive form of the word rex is regis, regis, and from that word we get the English word regal, which means of or related to a king. That's how it is with a lot of Latin words. We get English words from those Latin words. But the Spanish word for king is not rex, is it, Antonio?
No, the Spanish word for king would be rey.
So here we see a softening of the X sound at the end of the word rex. It softens over time from rex and becomes the Spanish word rey. Okay, next we have the word exercitus. That's the Latin word for army.
But in Spanish, it's ejército.
So again, we see the same thing. We see a softening of the X sound, the second letter of exercitus. We see that X sound softening to an H sound in ejército. The next Latin word here on our list is homo, which means man. I'm sure you've heard this word before when you hear the Latin name of human beings, which is Homo sapiens. So homo simply means man, as in mankind, in Latin. What about in Spanish, Antonio?
In Spanish would be hombre.
So that's a similar word, not exactly the same, but you can see how the word hombre comes from homo. Next on our list is terra, which means land. From the Latin word terra, we get the English word terrestrial, which means land-oriented or earth-oriented.
In Spanish would be tierra.
Tierra, so that's almost exactly the same, just one letter difference, right, Antonio?
Yes.
So that's very similar. The next word on our list is veritas. Typically, when you're studying Latin, the letter V sounds like a W. So you would pronounce this word like veritas, not veritas. And that means truth. Antonio, what about in Spanish?
In Spanish would be verdad.
So again, we see this softening of the sounds. The T in veritas is softened to a D, which is a less percussive, less harsh sound. The next Latin word on our list is octo, which means 8. This word is the root of the word October, which is the 10th month of the year. Now, you may be asking yourself, if October is the 10th month of the year, why would it be based on the Latin word for 8? Well, the answer to that is that originally it really was the 8th month of the year. And the Latin word novem, N-O-V-E-M, means 9. That's the root for the word November. And decem means 10. That's the root for December. So the month names for October, November, and December, they're simply based on the Latin words for 8, 9, and 10. Antonio, how would you say 8 in Spanish?
Ocho.
Again, we see this phenomenon of a softening of the sound from the harsh k sound in octo to a softer ch sound in ocho. The next Latin word on our list is arbor, which means tree. From the Latin word arbor, we get English words such as arboretum, which is like a special sanctuary for trees. What about in Spanish, Antonio? How would you say tree in Spanish?
That would be árbol.
So the Spanish word arbol is very similar to arbor, only one letter difference. And the last Latin word on our list is stella, which means star. From the Latin word stella, we get English words such as the English word stellar, which means relating to stars. What about in Spanish, Antonio?
That would be estrella.
So both of these words are spelled in a very similar way. We just have an E added to the front of the word, and we preserve the two L's together, but they're pronounced a bit differently, right?
Yes.
Well, we hope you've enjoyed this little foray into Latin. Really what we wanted to do here is just raise your awareness of the Latin language and how Spanish comes from Latin. And by the way, if you'd like to study Latin more seriously, we also have a book called Getting Started with Latin, which can help you do just that. If you'd like to see that book, you can go to gettingstartedwithlatin.com.